Today, I'm talking about arguably the most mysterious character in The Lord of the Rings. A guy who is so mysterious, we don't even know what he is. Maybe he's a mortal man in the service of Sauron, or maybe he's a high-ranking orc, or maybe he might even be a Nazgûl. We're never going to know for certain, but let's take a look at a few of the theories surrounding Gothmog of Minas Morgul, the Witch King's lieutenant, his second in command at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Maya Govan and Melanine, and welcome to another episode of Tolkien Untangled, Mysteries of Middle-earth. Before I begin, I will start by stating the obvious. There is, of course, another, more famous Gothmog in Tolkien's writings, Gothmog of the First Age, the Lord of all Balrogs, and one of the original Dark Lord's most powerful servants. But that's not who I'm talking about right now. Gothmog the Balrog died 6,500 years before The Lord of the Rings. The character this video is about is the Lieutenant of Minas Morgul, the guy who takes over from the Witch King after the Witch King is slain. So, let's start by looking at what Tolkien actually wrote about this character, which, as you may have guessed, isn't much. During the Battle of Pelennor Fields and the Siege of Minas Tirith that preceded it, the captain of Mordor's army was the Witch King of Angmar. But then the Witch King took a barrow blade to the knee and a sword to the face, and that turned out to be that. Meanwhile, Eomer of Rohan led his riders against the Haradrim's Mumakil, and the Knights of Dol Amroth, led by epic Prince Imrahil, rode to his aid. But the defenders soon found they were still outnumbered by the forces of Mordor. Hiding away in Osgiliath, a great force of Easterlings from Rhûn, Southrons from Harad, and Variags from Khand all waited to join the battle and to turn the tide back in Sauron's favour. And this great strength of reserve evil men was commanded by our guy Gothmog, the Lieutenant of Morgul. He flung all his reinforcements into the fray to try and destroy the forces of Rohan and Gondor. And that is everything we know about him. We don't know if he survived the battle, we don't know how he achieved the rank of lieutenant, we don't even know who he was. All we know is that after the Witch King, he was the highest ranking commander in Mordor's army during the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Everything else is speculation. But it's speculation that's been going on for about 70 years now, and although I'm confident we're never going to get to the bottom of it, all the different lines of conjecture do point us in some really interesting directions. What none of them do, however, is provide any kind of slam dunk point proving answers. This debate is probably going to continue for as long as people read Tolkien. Anyway, I guess at the heart of all this speculation is one straightforward, you'd think, question. What race does Gothmog belong to? Is he an evil man? Is he a mighty orc? Or is he potentially some hitherto unnamed Nazgûl? Well, all three options are perfectly valid. As I say, we're never going to know, but what I want to try and do with this video is put forward a few arguments and counter-arguments for each one, and thereby hopefully arm you with enough information to draw your own conclusions and come up with your own very cool ideas. And so, I'll start from the Gothmog was a mighty orc perspective. This is obviously the version Peter Jackson went with in his adaptation, and I think it's a version that works really well in his film. Portraying Gothmog as a particularly cunning orc chieftain, I think, is a great way of presenting him as a kinda liaison between the relatively mindless orc legions that he commands, and the much more intellectually gifted generals in charge of, overseeing the actual battle. I really like how in the film he's presented as a sickly, mutilated, and physically impaired orc who's probably not much good on the front lines, but is clearly quite a bit more intelligent than the rest of his rabble. We could also speculate that for Orc Gothmog to have achieved the rank of second in command to the Witch King, he must be a pretty ancient veteran of previous wars who's over time shown his terrible quality. So maybe he's one of the oldest orcs in Middle-earth. Maybe he was present during the Witch King's war against the Dunedain of the North. Perhaps he's even older than that. It seems highly unlikely, but it's possible he was one of the last surviving veterans of the War of the Last Alliance. Maybe 3,000 years before the War of the Ring, he was battling the armies of Elendil and Gil-galad for the fate of the Second Age. And although all evidence is incredibly circumstantial here, potentially the best piece of evidence for Orc Gothmog is the fact of his overall battle tactic, which sucks. We know from the Siege of Gondor chapter that the Witch King of Angmar, for all his faults, was a master strategist. He did a phenomenal job at crippling the City of Kings in under 2 days. Gothmog, on the other hand, he flings forth everyone he's got all at once, and that's it. That's the full extent of his strategizing. I guess it kind of makes sense if he's just wanting to, overwhelm the riders of Rohan and Gondor, but after Aragorn shows up on the Black Ships with major reinforcements, surely a fighting retreat, or at least any kind of battle formation, would have been a better strategy than just flinging all of your fighters at the enemy's fighters until your whole army is dead. That feels like quite an orcish thing to do. Although, of course, it is also possible that Gothmog might have had a much more cunning plan that would have made all the difference, except he was killed before getting a chance to implement it. Again, we just don't know. Although, as much as I do really enjoy Orc Gothmog in Peter Jackson's films, there are a couple of reasons why I personally don't believe he would be an orc in Tolkien's writings. And the first one is his name. Gothmog is Sindarin. If he's an orc, he is the only orc ever to get an elvish name. Of course, any servant of evil who's known as Gothmog probably would only be called that by their enemies. Gothmog means something like dread oppressor or dread tyrant in the elvish language of the Dunedain. But I still think it's unlikely that an orc, however ancient, would be afforded such a name, the same name as the Lord of the Balrogs from ages past. Then again, it certainly is possible, we just don't know. But if Gothmog were an orc with an elvish name, we can confidently speculate he must have hated it. He would never have spoken it. I think it would actually be quite physically painful if he ever tried to, and he would never let that name be uttered in his presence. Presumably he would have some other name in either some orcish language or perhaps in the Black speech of Mordor, and for all intents and purposes that would be his real name. Gothmog would simply be the title by which his enemies refer to him. So, if Gothmog were an orc, I think we'd have to speculate he's probably one of the most impressive specimens in the entire Legendarium. But another reason why I think he's more likely not to be an orc would be the nature of the forces under his command. Basically, the only concrete fact we get about this character, except that he's a lieutenant of Morgul with an elvish name, is that in the Battle of Pelennor Fields, he commanded great companies of men from Rhûn, men from Harad, and men from Khand. It doesn't prove anything, but it makes me think Gothmog is therefore probably more likely to be a man himself. This mannish version of the character is what's conjured in my imagination. But even if Tolkien stated absolutely that yes, Gothmog is supposed to be a man, we would still be left with quite a few interesting questions. For example, a man from where? It's possible that Manish Gothmog might be a high-ranking captain from Rune or Harad or Khand, considering, they are the forces under his command in this battle. But if he were from the far south or the far east, firstly, I think he's way less likely to be known by an elvish name, and secondly, I think he's less likely to be the lieutenant of the formerly Gondorian city of Minas Morgul. If I had to choose, I would suggest Gothmog, Lieutenant of the Tower of Morgul, is most likely a great and powerful black Numenorean, an evil man who shares kinship with the men of Gondor, but whose ancestors have been servants of Sauron's for, potentially, millennia. I think it makes sense that a black Numenorean would command this diverse Manish faction of Mordor's army, and then take full command of said army when he learned of the Witch King's demise. And I also think it makes sense that if he were a lord among the black Numenoreans, all the inhabitants of Minas Morgul, who aren't, Nazgûl, might agree, yes, this guy is indeed worthy of being the Witch King's second-in-command, which I'm not convinced an orc could achieve. However, perhaps the strongest piece of evidence for a black Numenorean lieutenant of Minas Morgul is the fact that a few chapters later we meet a different lieutenant of a different Dark Tower, the Lieutenant of Barad-dûr, the Mouth of Sauron. We are explicitly told the Mouth of Sauron is a black Numenorean who entered the service of the Dark Tower when it first rose again. This is obviously, again, still very circumstantial, but perhaps we could speculate there might be some connection between these two lieutenants of Sauron's two mightiest towers. Maybe Gothmog and the Mouth of Sauron entered the service of Mordor together, or at least maybe they originated from the same black Numenorean community. Perhaps they are both members of the same high-ranking family. If Gothmog is a black Numenorean, though, I think we should probably speculate that his authority to give orders only extends to the men and the orcs of Minas Morgul. It seems highly unlikely to me that any Nazgûl would ever take instruction from someone who isn't either Sauron or the Witch King. I guess, therefore, the command structure of Minas Morgul might look something like the Witch King, right at the top, it is his city, and below him on one side are the rest of the Nazgûl, and on the other side is Gothmog, the black Numenorean. Then underneath Gothmog there are all the other people and creatures of the dead city, but the other 8 Nazgûl are kind of separate from his authority. However, there is, of course, also that third option. Maybe Gothmog is one of the 9. Perhaps he's a ringwraith. I think this option is slightly less likely than the black Numenorean explanation, but it's also potentially quite a bit more cool. I mean, who better for the Lord of the Nazgûl to have as his lieutenant than another Nazgûl? Plus, if this were the case, it now makes a lot of sense that this ancient, potentially Numenorean warrior, sorcerer, and tyrant of old would be known to all Elvish-speaking people as the Dread Oppressor, as Gothmog. Perhaps Gothmog was involved in the hunt for the ring. Perhaps he was there at Weathertop. Perhaps he was there 4,000 years ago when Sauron gave out rings of power. Now, it's true that elsewhere in Tolkien's writings, we are told that the second-in-command among the Nazgûl was a guy called Khamûl, the Shadow of the East. However, I don't think this in any way discredits the argument that Gothmog was second-in-command of the Nazgûl at Pelennor Fields, because we are explicitly told in the appendices, on the exact same day as the Battle of Pelennor Fields, but many, many miles away, the elvish realm of Lothlorien came under attack by an army from Dol Guldur. And although we can't say for certain, I think it's highly likely that this Dol Guldur army was commanded by Khamûl. We know for a fact he was the commander of Dol Guldur for many, many years before this. Which would mean Khamûl is far too busy in southern Mirkwood to be present for the Siege of Gondor, Maybe while he was doing that, the Witch King chose the third among the Nazgûl, our guy Gothmog, to be his lieutenant in the War of the Ring. Honestly, though, I think possibly the strongest argument for deciding Gothmog's one of the otherwise unknown Nazgûl is that it's just so cool. And if we accept it as true, we can increase our knowledge of individual Nazgûl identities by 50%. One was the Witch King of Angmar, one was Khamûl, the Black Easterling, and maybe one was Gothmog, the Morgul lieutenant, this commander of evil men, the wraith that took over when the Witch King was slain. And one of the few Mordor survivors of this battle. Because, of course, if Gothmog were an orc or a man, then the most likely end to his story is probably that he died with his army upon the fields of Pelennor. But if he's a Nazgûl, he must have survived, along with his fellbeast. 5 days after this battle, Aragorn and his army begin their march to the Black Gate, and on the way, they notice 8 surviving Nazgûl flying overhead, Gothmog included, if that's the conclusion we've come to. Now, potentially I would suggest the strongest argument against Gothmog being a Nazgûl would be the simple fact that if it were true, it would be a huge deal, and yet Tolkien never mentioned it. I'm aware that might not be very convincing. The list of things Tolkien never mentioned is literally infinite, but he did mention the Nazgûl quite a few times across quite a few writings. He wrote about Khamûl and the Witch King quite a few times, but he never once mentioned Gothmog, outside of a single sentence in a single book in which the Nazgûl are major villains. If Tolkien intended Gothmog to be one of them, surely he would have said so. It's really crazy to me that until early September in 1973, there totally was an answer to this question. Tolkien must have had an idea of who Gothmog was when he wrote that name in the Battle of Pelennor Fields chapter. And if someone had written to him and asked him, we almost certainly would have gotten an answer. Maybe someone did ask, and maybe they did get that answer, but their letter was lost, and so we don't know about it. Sadly, the specifics of who Gothmog truly was seem to have died with the Professor. And unless some long-lost letter gets found one day, which if it does, I promise to do a follow-up video, we'll probably never know how Tolkien himself imagined this minor villain. But I guess the flip side of that, we are all now free to conjure Gothmog in our own mind's eye in whichever way we please. He is a truly malleable character whose details exist only in our collective imaginations. Anyway, that's it for this Mysteries of Middle-earth mini-episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to hit like and leave a comment and click subscribe if you haven't already to make sure you don't miss any future videos coming soon. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Nevair Melanin.